Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. How to make a Bowie knife with Celtic Basket Weave metal etching on the blade. Now this particular knife has walnut scales combined with a green acrylic. Also has brass bolsters and a very unique blade etching. Now, this project started with a water jet cut blank. It's available from DIYEasyCrafts.com. And I etched the edge of the blade to show the center line. Then, just as with most knife projects, I'm going to start to grind the bevels. I'm using a jig from Belknap Custom Knives that just helps to glide that knife perfectly level to the grinder. It really creates some nice bevels. But I've covered knife making on quite a few different videos. I'm going to kind of go through this one pretty quick. What I did was I printed out the design of the basket weave on a Silhouette Cameo craft vinyl cutting machine. And then I transferred that self-adhesive vinyl stencil onto the blade. I used a clear transfer film for this so I could position that stencil accurately as to where I wanted it on the blade. And then my preferred method of metal etching is using a car battery charger, a 12-volt charger set at 2 amps. I connect the positive lead to the blade, and the negative lead I clamp to a gauze pad that's kind of folded up, and I dip that into a salt water solution as the electrolyte. And then what I do is I just dampen the entire area that I want etched, and then I take my time and I just place that negative lead on one particular spot for about 10 to 20 seconds, 20 seconds at the max. And then I slowly move it down the blade, leaving it for 20 seconds in each spot until I cover the entire area. And I do that at least 3 times. You want a minimum of about 1 minute of etching for the entire surface. And depending on how deep you want it, you can go upwards of just about 2 minutes if you want a really deep etch. It's not a hard process. The self-adhesive vinyl is a resist, so basically everything that's covered with that vinyl does not get etched. Once the etching is done, I can turn off the battery charger, disconnect my leads, and then just peel away that vinyl to reveal the etching underneath. Now, depending on what you're etching and what the particular stencil dimensions are, sometimes it's easier to pull these things off just with a razor knife. Other times, like in this case, it's probably easier just to use a fingernail if you have a good fingernail or two. But anyway, I was very pleased with the design. This basket weave pattern really seemed to stand out very, very nicely. Just polished it up with a little 400 grit emery paper. Cleaned it up a little bit. And then I'm just going to finish off the knife. So I brought this blade over to my friend Jason's shop. I had it heat treated. After the heat treating, I put it in an oven, 375 degrees for 3 hours, and I let it cool overnight as a tempering process. This is the image of what the blades look like after they're heat treated. So again, it gets polished after either the heat treating and the tempering, just same 400 grit emery, quick polish. And then I moved on to the brass bolsters. Now I pin my brass bolsters on. I also use an epoxy, and then I pin those the ends of those 1/8 diameter brass pins in place after the epoxy sets. So this is just clamping the bolsters in place with the epoxy, and I'll set that aside and let it dry. I'm not going to show every single step of the process, but the scales that I made for this one are a combination of walnut and green acrylic, and the material is actually used for pens. You can buy pen blanks on the internet. The colors are pretty dynamic. What I do is I mount one of the scales to the blade with a clamp and epoxy, really pushing that forward to make sure that there's no gap between the scales or the handles and that bolster. This is called the North Guard method of mounting scales. Once that scale or the epoxy has completely hardened, I clamp it onto a piece of wood on top of my drill press, and I drill a hole through the pre-existing holes on the handle through the scale material. And then I'm just going to repeat this process. So I'll drill a hole the exact same way in the back of this handle, and then once the holes are done on the one side, I'll glue the other half of the scales or handles onto the blade, and then I will drill holes through the existing holes on the other side, so that there's always a hole to act as the guide, and the final product is knife handles that are perfectly flush with the bolsters, and yet you don't have any problems with the pins because the drill has gone through both sides of the handles as well as the blade, all in one shot, one final shot. Anyway, after both sides of the scales are attached and the epoxy is dried, I can trim those to size. I just use a pin saw to cut away the majority of the excess material. And it doesn't really matter how you do this. I do it with a disc grinder and a flap sanding wheel. This one I think was a 60 grit. You could do it on a belt sander, but you want to trim down that material so that it's equal with this top surface of the tang of the knife. I use the same flap sanding wheel to kind of trim the bolsters to shape, and then I also use that same flap sanding wheel to start to curve the corners and round over the edges of my handles, kind of smoothing them all out, basically until they're comfortable in my hand. You just have to have a light touch with that disc grinder. You're really just taking off a minimal amount with each stroke. You don't want to lean into it at this point. You could really ruin the scales very, very easily. In addition to the disc grinder and the flap sanding wheel, I do use a Dremel with a drum sanding wheel on it. It's really good to getting into the rounded corners and the small areas that you have a little bit of a hard time getting in there with a disc grinder. And then you have to sand, especially with the acrylic. So what I did was I sanded everything with an 80 grit. Then I went to a 220, and then because I'm working with the acrylic on this one, I did hand sand to a 600 grit. Once the sanding's done, I did give it a quick buff. I basically buffed out the bolsters and the brass pins as well as that acrylic material. And actually, after I finished buffing and I cleaned it up a little bit, I was so impressed with this knife, I like the knife so much. I actually went back and added some additional detail. I did some spine etching on it, which is a weave design on the spine with a 4-leaf clover on either end, kind of sticking with that Celtic theme. Some images of the finished product. So this blade is 1095 high carbon steel, brass bolsters, green acrylic and walnut scales with spine etching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I ask that if you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please check us out on the web at DIYeasycrafts.com and be sure to check out our other how-to knife making videos. Thank you.